lost track again. I think this is number 9. I don't know what you guys think about these videos so far. I just thought I would have loved it if my dad would have made some videos just so that I could see him again. I think maybe you guys might not even watch these till I'm dead and gone. Either way, I'm just gonna keep on. And I know I'm not very good at it, and I know that maybe it's disjointed and all that kind of stuff, but I'm hoping that a little nugget of gold will drop out here somewhere and you can use these, what would you call them, these wisdoms. Now, not for me, like I said before. They're from people that I have found that are super geniuses, and I'm just standing on their shoulders. Today we're gonna, and the reason we're gonna do this is because a lot of you guys are going into college or are in college, and you literally are gonna get a one-sided view from your professors. I know it's going to be a liberal view, and I know if they do mention an opposing view, they won't give it much time, or they'll shoot it down and you just won't get to mull it around in your head properly. See, that's what freedom is about, and freedom of speech and all that kind of stuff. It's about having these opposing views so that you can look at both sides and make up your own mind, form your own worldview. I would be horrible in a debate because I think very slowly. Maybe 20 years ago I would have been good at it, but I think too slow and I'm not smart enough. So if I debated someone that was smarter and faster talking and just knew all the debating tricks, could slaughter me, and maybe their position is totally wrong, but they would win the debate. The way to really formulate your worldview is to truly look at both sides, get both sides an equal shot. And that brings me to a guy named Dr. Wolfgang Smith. This guy's 93 years old. If you watched the interview with him or read any of his books, he's sharp as a tack. He's like me, he talks slowly, but because he was a college professor, he articulates his words much better than I do. He's not afraid to say something that's controversial and it's totally against the mainstream. He's so convinced, and he's convincing, and he enjoys giving interviews. And he's precise and concise and coherent, and he says the just right words. I really enjoy this guy, Dr. Wolfgang Smith. Now, think about this. He went to Cornell when he was 15 years old. Graduated when he was 18 with a degree in philosophy, physics, the philosophy of science, and metaphysics. You get that? That's a super genius right there. Then he went on to Purdue and earned some more degrees, I think, in physics and mathematics. Then he went to Columbia University and got his PhD. Now, after that, he went to work for Bell Aerodynamics, and he's the guy that solved the re-entry problem. Uses physics, uses mathematics, and he's the guy that solved it. In other words, if your re-entry is too flat of an angle, you bounce off the atmosphere and off into outer space. If your reentry is too steep, you burn up in reentry. There's very critical place, angle, and depends on the area of the earth that you're coming in and all that kind of stuff. It's quite a formula that you can come in and not burn up. Well, he had to calculate that before they ever did it, right? It's not one of these things, well, oh, that was too steep, everybody died. Oh, that was too flat, everybody died. He calculated this thing and it worked. But then he went to work as a professor of mathematics at MIT, right? You don't get any better than that. From MIT, went to work for UCLA as a professor, and then wound up in Oregon State as a professor. Now, while he was doing his professoring, he was writing scientific journals, and they were being published by all kinds of academics. And they specialized in the philosophy of science and metaphysics. All right. So I'm going to put up here a little bit of information on some of the guys that he's going to mention in this interview. And the first guy is Democritus. He lived around 400 BC. He's the guy that came up with the atomic hypothesis. You get that? 2,400 years ago, Democritus hypothesized that things were made out of atoms. So he says there are two things. There is the atom and the void. That's pretty smart for being 400 BC. Now in 1600 AD, you have René Descartes. You know, his famous quote is, "I think, therefore I am." And there's, you know, it's this philosophical mumbo jumbo. Do I exist? Well, I think, therefore I do exist. Well, what's a thought? And on it goes. You know, this could go on forever. He also is the one to come up with the Cartesian geometry. And he had the thing, he wrote actually a book, you could call it, The Principles of Philosophy. And he came up with what's called the method of hyperbolic and metaphysical doubt. And I won't get into that, but that's his thing. And he's the one that postulated the bifurcation hypotheses. And that boils down to two things exist, not the atom and the void, but things and thoughts. So you could say the atoms and thoughts. All right, and old Wolfgang is going to address all that. Then there's a guy named James Gibson. This is kind of a spoiler to the interview, but James Gibson did experiments. He's a psychologist. He did experiments in visual perceptions. In other words, if the only thing that exists is what you perceive to exist, and how that photons go to your retina turns to electrical impulses, that gets to your brain, these are your thoughts. An Air Force or a Navy pilot should not be able to land on an aircraft carrier. There's not enough input for that to work. He proved this. And he came up with what's called the ecological psychology hypothesis. But because pilots can land, so that refutes this visual. We'll get into that. Actually, Wolfgang will get into that. I hope this doesn't get boring. I don't think it is. So if I have my notes correct, I've already got them messed up. Here we go. Now he's being interviewed by a guy named Brian Callen. So I already told you who this guy is. And one of the first things they do, they start talking about Einstein, and Dr. Smith said that the only thing Einstein got right was E equals mc squared. He said everything else he got was wrong. But the interview wasn't, okay, let's talk about that, because that would take hours. So okay, what can we say about that? And he says, well, okay, first we need to go clear back to the 5th century BC, the Greek philosopher named Democritus. He was the father of atomism. That was his hypothesis about atoms. He postulated the only things that exist are the atoms and the void. See, I'm quoting Dr. Smith now. Now, Plato was opposed to that idea. Right? For 2,000 years, the informed world treated that idea as heresy, the Democritus idea. So for 2,000 years, see, Dr. Smith claims to be a Platonist. In other words, he believes Plato's got things right. So for 2,000 years, they rejected Democritus. There's more than just atoms and the void. But in the 17th century, along comes René Descartes. And this Democritus was rediscovered, but never proved. Right? So Dr. Smith, I'm just going to call him Wolfgang, that sounds cool. Wolfgang says, but Plato was right. But the Democritus model became the model of what is now our modern model. So the modern physics, this is me talking, the modern physics has locked on to Democritus model of physics. Wolfgang says that's wrong. He'll explain. He says atoms do exist, but not in the sense that physicists think. That is the quantum physicist he's talking about. So the American physicist Feynman states no one understands quantum theory. He just admits it. They just don't understand it. He says it's not comprehensible. This is what Feynman says, and he's not a Platoist. He's a Democratist. You understand what I'm saying there? But he says it's not understandable, and Feynman is a famous American physicist. Wolfgang goes on, he says, quantum theory may be correct, but it is not comprehensible in terms of the philosophy of physics. The philosophy that has been adopted since the 17th century by Descartes, they came up with what they call bifurcation. And bifurcation means two parts, of course. It means there's material stuff and there's immaterial stuff, like a thought. So we're back to two things again. Not atom and the void, but atom. Everything's made of atoms. and thoughts, whatever that is. So we have physicists dealing with stuff that occupies space, but there's other stuff they don't deal with that occupies the mind. So see, they don't even deal with metaphysics. Even though they acknowledge it, it's just they don't deal with it. Now along comes a guy named Whitehead. And he says that Descartes is invalid. The result of that axiom is a complete model in our understanding of physics, but this model falls on deaf ears. Bifurcation was too ingrained in the physicists. In other words, this guy comes up with this, it's called the philosophy of organisms. And you see that today. There are things that scientists just won't listen to. Evolutionists will not listen to creationists. They just won't. That's a different story. So Smith Wolfgang says, the consequence of bifurcation is that you do not perceive the external world. There is this retinal image theory. Light strikes the retina. From there it's turned to electric signals that go to the brain, visual signals, visual sensors. There's like 20 or 21 visual sensors. Somehow that winds up in the cortex of your brain. You know, in the on-off position of neurons. So in your brain kind of works like, this is me talking. In your brain kind of works like a computer. You have like zeros and ones, you know, on and off positions. But they have what is called the binding problem. This is what Wolfgang calls the binding problem. That is, we look at a landscape, we don't see on and off neurons, we see a unity of landscape. Now the retina image theory is unbelievable. And as soon as I heard him say that, my thought was, okay, I've understood this for a long time. Reality is only what you perceive. That's what it boils down to. You know, you can read 500 pages and it boils down to reality is only our perception of reality. And to that I say, what about the guy that got run over by the Mack truck that he didn't perceive coming from behind him? He got just as run over and he didn't perceive it. So he was, well, he never did, because he just turned into mush on the pavement. So Wolfgang and me are on the same page there. Now comes a guy named of James Gibson. He did, this is Wolfgang speaking, he did visual experiments on visual perception and found of the visual perception there was not enough for pilots to land on aircraft carriers. Because we can land on aircraft carriers, then the retinal image theory is wrong. Get it? I got it. Now Gibson realized there is a new way of understanding visual perception. After 30 years of empirical work, he came up with the ecological theory of visual perception, referencing the environment. What we see is the environment. Now the cognitive psychologists are on board. They're on board with that. Now, I said all that to say this. The Democritus model is still being taught, but this new / old ecological theory of visual perception is more correct. So we're getting into philosophy. Used to be a physicist, just wouldn't have anything to do with a philosopher. And a philosopher and a physicist couldn't even really have a conversation. But now it's to the point where physics has gone to the point where we have to start talking to the philosophers, because this is just, it's beyond us. And they start talking to philosophers, and the philosophers go, yeah, I've been trying to tell you that the whole time. So Wolfgang says there are two physicists: the technical guy, the one that tells the engineers how to build stuff. Then they have the physicist that tells you the color is in the mind, not in the real world. This guy is a physicist and a philosopher. He may be a good physicist, but he's a bad philosopher. Because, this is still Wolfgang speaking, because color is an ingredient of the external world as much as matter is. Alright? So Smith says, the interviewer asked him, he says, so there are bad physicists that are good philosophers and good physicists that are bad philosophers? And Smith says, physicists, good and bad, are bad philosophers. Even Feynman. We don't integrate physics and spirit or soul because physics cannot offer anything there. Physics answers quantitative answers to quantitative problems. So he's not saying that physics is no good, because he's a physicist too. But it deals with these quantitative problems. Wolfgang says you can't elevate physics to metaphysics. The bifurcation of René Descartes is simply not true. This model is why most physicists are atheists. Okay? He says, by the way, Descartes was not an atheist, because he also came up with what he calls the veracity of God, but that's another story. So studying Descartes, these physicists become atheists, but Descartes was not an atheist. They're missing something, right? Smith says, Wolfgang, man is tripartite. Corpus, animo, spiritus. And according to Plato, the cosmos is similarly tripartite. That is, man is body, mind, and spirit. The spirit and soul are two different things. I think I talked about this in one of my previous videos. So spirit is beyond space and time. All being is derived from beyond space and time. So now Wolfgang's being a philosopher now, right? Wolfgang calls this irreducible wholeness. In other words, the wholeness that is more than the sum of its parts. So a physicist has to make the sum of your parts what you are entirely. But we're finding out that what we are entirely is more than the sum of those parts. Alright? A lot of times they just don't want to deal with that. Oh, now we're talking metaphysics. Yeah, we are. They don't want to talk about that. So that's part of the formula that they're missing, because they simply won't go there. They just won't. He talks about this. It is derived from a plane of the cosmos which is above space and time. This is what Wolfgang's saying, you know, the super genius guy. Wolfgang spent time with the real yogis that dealt with reality on 3 levels. He went in the Himalayas and spent time with these, I think he called them sadhus. They're like the enlightened yogis that meditate all the time. He wanted to learn from them because he knew there was more than just physics, and these guys seemed like the most spiritual guys. So they believed there was 3 levels: the corporeal, that's space and time; the intermediary, that is subject to time alone; then the intelligible, which is subject neither to space nor time. The Sanskrit word is Tribhuvana. That means triple world. Now, a real sadhus won't even accept a Western disciple because their teachings are only meant for their people. The Western mind will never be able to understand this Eastern concept that to be a disciple of them. They just won't accept you if you have a Western frame of mind. Now the Vedic religion is the oldest religion in the world. It even antedates the birth of Abraham. So as soon as I heard that, I thought about the book of Enoch. And that's for a whole other video. That's very interesting too. He says, by the way, that path is also celibacy. So to even start that path, you have to take a vow of complete celibacy for life. And Wolfgang also notes that the Platonistic Academy, you know, Plato's school, was also celibate. They also had a lifelong vow. It says this pertains to sensation versus perception. To understand the 2 higher levels, a yogi's path is necessary. So you have to get out of this sensational part of your being in order for your perceptional part to see these higher levels. Wolfgang says that that was never his goal to be, you know, a Hindu mystic, or he just was. It was interesting. He wanted to go to the horse's mouth, so to speak, find out exactly what they believed and their practices. Well, my camera died again. I don't know. I guess I'm going to have to figure out. Did it only last 22 minutes? I'll have a timer so that I can have a little intermission and then just restart it. Problem solved. In the meantime, I went and had a pizza and tried one of these. Mountain Dew Energy Mental Boost. So, oh, and immune support. So this is going to boost my mental capacity. So I'll probably be using much bigger words. I apologize for that. So I had to watch the first video to see where it kicked off. So hopefully this is I can pick up where I left off. That mental boost isn't working yet. Maybe I need to give it some time. Okay, Wolfie, as I like to call him, he probably would rather I called him Mr. Smith. But Wolfie said, in India I became acquainted with the Vedic religion. I respect it, but it is not for me. I distinguish it sharply between the Vedic and the Judeo-Christian religion. The Judeo-Christian religion is something completely different. There are no words in Sanskrit for Judeo-Christian concepts. Just isn't even in their language. In other words, Sanskrit has no word for sin. They have karma. When you understand karma, you do good things, you get good things. You do bad things, you get bad things. That's kind of the law of reciprocity. Kind of the biblical teaching would be you shall reap what you sow. But karma is not the same as sin. They have no word for sin or concept of sin. So Wolfie said he was a freshman at Cornell when he picked up the book by Rabindranath Tagore. I'm certain I pronounced that correctly. He's a Hindu poet. He even won a Nobel Prize for his poems. It's in a book called Gitanjali. I think I'd like to find that book and read it, because he read that at age 14 and it moved him deeply, he said, and it got him interested in philosophy. So at age 15, when he went to Cornell, one of his majors was philosophy. So he wanted to go meet the yogis in India, but it wasn't until many, many years later he had a space of 7 or 8 months between his professorship at MIT and UCLA, and he had the money, so he went to the high Himalayas, you know, to the yogis way up in the high mountains, and he questioned them and watched what they were doing, and he was thoroughly impressed. He said they meditate for 20 hours a day. He says, I'm certain they do this astral projection where they're out of their body. He says, because you can stick a knife right in their leg and they won't even flinch. They're just not even in their body. He mentions, and I remember watching this, back during the Vietnam War, I think it was a Tibetan monk, to protest the war, he had one of his students poured gasoline on him, then he lit the match, and he just sat there. He didn't scream, he didn't flinch, he didn't shiver, he just sat there and burned until he just fell over. He wasn't in his body when that happened. I remember thinking that myself. No one could just sit there while they burned to death. Well, they can if your spirit's not in there. So anyway, put all that in your head to rattle around, because I am certain that these professors are going to lean you one direction and they're not going to give philosophy or metaphysics the time of day. And if they do, they'll do it in a dishonest way. They'll find somebody that really doesn't know what they're talking about and they'll debunk him. But they won't give a guy like Dr. Wolfgang Smith a platform to really give you something to think about. That's what America's about. That's what this free speech is. Got this guy, and he knows what he's talking about. You take this other guy, and he knows what he's talking about. And you take those two, they might even be diametrically opposed views, but you weigh them, and you use that to mold your worldview. You're right in the middle of doing that, whether you know it or not. You're constructing a worldview. And that's kind of one of the things that grandpas like to do. They like to help their grandkids mold their worldviews. And I'm not trying to sway you one way or another. I'll tell you, where I'm at on this line, this worldview line, and which direction I lean, but I want to give you the opportunity to make up your own line in an honest way. And that's why I chose Wolfgang. He's about as smart and savvy about this as you can get. So, with that, I love you guys, and stay tuned for the next one, because I really don't have any idea what it's going to be yet. I'll try to make it interesting. I love you guys. Bye.